set the stage when we say supply chain reset and how the supply chain planning would be supporting this larger touchless supply chain function. What does we entail to? Last 2, 3 years, we saw that COVID changed the way supply chain was behaving. Then there were industry changes, and then came the geopolitical and economic changes where the world has moved from a unipolar supply chain to a bipolar supply chain. The way the organizations are moving from China out from China. So there is a change or disruption which is happening in the supply chain world. And all of us acknowledge that and how that has uh, evolved and what are the areas, how organizations are moving ahead. So those are the point of discussions which we have. We will see and touch upon certain niche areas of which are typically a boardroom discussion, how the chat GPTs of the world, or when we say AI MLs of the world are changing the way the supply chains will behave. All those will be our discussion points. So let me start with a question to my esteemed panel out here with Jaya, that how organizations which are global in nature, they are behaving and the disruptions are changing the way we are moving ahead in the supply chain world.
I think the topic's really interesting. Whether are we ready for the reset for the supply chain piece? I think one big testament to this is the whole audience, all the supply chain leaders sitting here, and where we're talking about the innovations of the world. Yes, we are ready, and specifically in Indian context, if I have to say, right, India is actually leading. A lot of places they are leading in terms of the supply chain automation. It's like, it's a myth that, only Western worlds are, I would say, going towards innovation and, doing things to, reduce the cost. So I think the biggest cost pressures which we have seen is in the Indian economy. And they are the ones who really want to go forward and, reset the whole piece. And I would say, the big guys are already doing it. So they're already there with the innovation piece, with the automation piece, which you call as a touchless supply chain, it's there. So innovation usually starts from vision. Like some leaders have already seen the vision even before COVID, and they were working towards this whole automation piece and bringing innovation in the supply chain. But after COVID, it has become a necessity. It is a commodity. Everybody, every industry, whether it's logistics, whether it's your manufacturing, whether it's your e-com has changed the game for everyone. So e-com has actually done so much in the last mile piece, which is an example for the world. It is achievable. Now you get your groceries in 10 minutes, right? You just order it online and you get it, right? If the supply chain is not touchless, it's impossible to do, right? And I think the manufacturing piece is also catching up. How can we do better? How can we provide better? And that's where all the logistics players who are doing the delivery, who are managing the warehousing, they have to bring in the automation and innovation so that they have a cutting technology to provide to the clients. I think we just saw All Cargo presenting, right? Why these warehouses are getting so beautifully built these days? Because to manage the current demand. So just to begin with the question, yes, we are ready for the reset. I think we are ahead in the game.
Thanks. Great perspective in terms of the global reset. Let's see what is a reset actually all about. We were doing our Google searches and Microsoft came with a Bing as a search engine. No one used that Bing, right? But then there was large language models of chat GPTs. That will change the whole industry of how the search will happen. So those are the reset points. And the same thing is happening in the supply chain world. And one of the areas in supply chain world where a reset is happening in the supply chain planning space. Let's hear from Samrat how the global disruptions are making the way for supply chain planning function in the organization.
Thanks for the question. I think, when I think about this question, I think the top of the mind, few companies come to my mind, JC Penney, Virgin, Atlantic, Hertz. These were some of the organizations which actually became bankrupt during the COVID. And some of these, companies faced issues because they were not able to manage their finances. But many of the companies, and the list is very long, many of the companies actually became bankrupt because they were not able to manage their supply chains itself. Now, I'm not talking about Gartner. In my mind, there are basically three types of organizations which are there. in the universe if you talk about maturity of the supply chains or the maturity of the organization, how it views its own supply chain. So there are companies, top companies, which actually look at supply chain as a core competence for themselves. So those were the companies who have been investing behind the supply chains for a long time. Then there were other two types of companies. The second rung of companies, you can say that the ones who thought that supply chain is managing the availability and supply chain is actually bringing cost on the table. So they were trying to manage the demand and reduce the cost. These were the second set of companies. Then there were third set of companies who were probably ignorant about the function, and someone in the background was working and ensuring availability, but no one was actually bothered about the function as such. During these disruptions, actually what has happened is that supply chain or the CEOs have realized that probably during disruptions it is not the brand which is competing in the marketplace, it is actually the supply chain which competes. The company whose product is available will be the company whose product will be bought. So that's the realization which actually has made sure that all these three type of companies, especially the second and third rung companies, they started investing behind the supply chain. And the importance of supply chain planning, the fact that any supply chain actually the base of supply chain is actually the supply chain planning, the fact that many other functions are also involved in the supply and operations planning, and the inputs have to be received by the other functions so that the supply chain planning works properly. This realization actually happened during this period of disruption. And since it became a matter of survival for the organizations, all the organizations have now started investing behind supply chain and have understood the importance of supply chain planning as per me.
So true, so true. We can't even have a better time to talk on supply chain planning.
I'd like to add here before your next question. So I think there is a fourth type of thing as well, which is the new age startups. So we all saw the, I would say the wave of startups which came in to the world, and India being at the precipice, like so many coming in. I think they realized this fact. They learned from the mistakes, they learned from COVID, and when they were starting up, all these companies who came as new age companies, they actually started up with building the right things, and they did use the technology at the first place itself, starting up and pioneering, and then of course improving on top of that. So they understood this is a baseline which we can't really do afterwards. We have to start with it. So I think those are the companies also creating a mark.
Yeah, just to add, it's the example, perfect example is how the heart behaves when there is a part of the body where, some attack is happening from outside. That is the part where maximum blood is actually pumped. So that's the way organizations are behaving now.
So true. I can relate to example. Morning, I started my car, and my car said, "Do you want a software upgrade?" This is happening, and those upgrades are happening now. Earlier, those were happening in my iPhones and the smart watches. Now the cars are happening those upgrades, and that's the way the our supply chain industry is also moving, and the upgrades are required in the supply chain world also. Let's hear more in terms of the recent things which we are hearing a lot in the AI or artificial intelligence, machine learning space, how organizations are evolving, and that what are the implications on the supply chain world. So Jaya, why not you only take that up?
Yeah, so I know being in technology, where you'll ask technology questions, definitely. So yes, AI, Gen AI, machine learning, it's changing the world. We all have seen. Earlier, we didn't have options like you can get a slot delivery. Say, I am at home only in 3 to 6, and I can just collect my parcel at that time only. So do you have the capability to deliver in a slot? Earlier, it was a dream, right? You can get it on the slot. Now you can. I don't want to get things delivered on a weekday, but I want to. And address is the biggest challenge in India. So we have addresses like Mandir ke piche, gali ke bahar. Like, how do you get to those places? So now these technologies are actually enabling the customers to pin their location. So riders can talk with you who are coming to deliver, right? And if they are confused by the addresses which are coming on the applications, today machine learning, AI, all these technologies have solved these problems already. Now we don't have to worry. The rider will just call you, okay, just send your WhatsApp location, I'll follow and come. So technology is giving you all those options, all those conveniences which were not there. Like, these were real problems to solve for any courier company. Okay, the address is not right. What do I do? Just take the reverse logistics cost, which is going to come in and not deliver. So it was hampering the customer experience big time. So I think in the B2C space, definitely, it's a big improvement which we have seen. And these algorithms will also work wonders when it comes to the B2B space, where demand, forecasting, all these absolute areas of improvement will be there. So I think without technology, I don't see a future with this in the supply chain. These are now mandatory. As I said, it's commoditized. Everybody's using it. And Gen AI changed the game altogether, right? Initially, we were writing blogs and stuff. Now, everything is done by ChatGPT, right? You don't have to even think about it. So, yeah.
You actually see the phenomena of, today there are companies who do not own any product. Just on the back of technology and supply chain, those companies are working. So that has never happened in the past. So, that's the importance and the development in these two areas which has enabled these organizations. And these are probably one of the, some of the highest valuation companies across the world. So
Exactly. So true. Means if we see this insightful discussion happening around here, so many areas. And my next question would go to Avinash. Uh, what happened? All of you would be hearing a lot in terms of what the cyclone which came in Chennai. So organizations have to move really fast, quickly respond to supply or these demand disruptions which are happening. Last year it was Suez Canal where a lot of things happened in the maritime world. Let's hear from Avinash means how organizations are moving the way or changing the needle in the supply disruptions ways, how they can move quickly and faster in those sites.
Sure. So, in terms of disruptions, there are two kinds of disruptions. If we take a step back, that happens for an organization. One, which is triggered by external events. The others are which are triggered by the internal processes, systems, or whatever, the way the supply chains are designed, or way the organization's designed. Now, obviously, any disruption puts a lot of stress either on the supply chains or the entire organization itself. So supply chains have to be geared up in a certain way to handle these disruptions. And if you have to break this down into 3 levels, and taking certain learnings of, across what I have seen a couple of organizations trying to build that kind of a capability, what we have been trying to do, in bits and pieces, in small parts, in our case as well, is first be able to sense some of these disruptions. Obviously, there are certain disruptions which you can't. What happened in the Suez Canal, you can't. Cyclone to an extent, you can't. COVID, you couldn't have, etc. But still, there are certain disruptions that can be sensed, and both internal and external. And the ability to sense this, well before it happens, is what builds in a certain amount of capability to handle those disruptions. A classic example is, and how does that happen? So, for a longest time, and I'll take a CPG example, right? For a longest time, the companies did not have the visibility to the inventory that was held at stores, right? And I'm talking of a couple of years from now back. Now, every time that the demand was hit for a certain reason, the competitors would have brought in a new product, the product wasn't working or whatever, it took a lot of time for the companies to know that there is an issue, the product's not flying off the shelf, and then to make those changes in terms of either supplies or whatever, right? Now and so the first step that the companies took was to figure out ways of capturing some of that inventory information, either it is in their trade, right? Either it is at the distributor levels, in certain cases also trying to figure out, can they get tertiary inventory information, etc. And those initial early signals used to give that information back saying, there's something wrong, you need to retweak, look at it, double click, deep dive, etc., whatever, right? So the sensing of some of these disruptions becomes a very critical capability, and which is where technology plays an important role now, where there are ways now, so we as a company, for example, sell directly to a consumer and also to traditional trades. And we realize the challenges that we have in traditional trades in terms of identifying some of these signals, but in direct consumer sales, it's very easy and quicker, where you can identify some of these demand changes and then, take that information and tweak it around. So the first one is the whole ability to sense these changes. The second one is, once the changes are sensed, how do you relay this information back in your value chain? Because just knowing that there is a disruption that's going to happen is not going to make a difference, right? Again, supply chains, for a longest time, companies believed that the supply chains were, for the organization, were working in silos or in isolation, right? But supply chains are very interconnected system, right? So there are suppliers of suppliers, and so on and so forth. It goes, back couple of levels, 2 or 3 levels upstream and 2 or 3 levels downstream as well, right? So there are super stockists, distributors, retailers, and so forth. So whenever there is an information or a disruption that's sensed, how does that information get relayed back in the system? And this is dependent on 2 factors. One, obviously, technology is playing a part, where if your systems are interconnected, you're able to relay that information. If your distributor system is connected to yours, right, so the distributor management system, you're able to sense that information and relay it back. If your systems are connected to or your supply systems are connected to yours, then you can also relay it back, right? So that is one part that makes a difference. The second one is the processes that an organization has. A classic example, right? An organization has a monthly S&OP cycle. You have sensed a disruption mid of the month, but your process is designed in a certain way that you can't relay this information back till the end of the month happens when the cycles run, right? So process then is the second important factor that plays an important part. So both of these put together enables the capability of an organization to relay this information back in the value chain where they can make those corrections, right? And the third and the most important part is the capability of a supply chain, which is obviously the organization, supply chain, and the suppliers, etc., to act on that information once it's relayed back. A lot of times the supply chains aren't designed to work in a certain agile fashion, right? So even if, let's say, there is an information that comes that a product's not working, for example, a new product's been launched, it's not working, and you have got that information as an organization. You've also relayed it back to the supplier. The supplier says, oh, you know what, but I have a huge order on RM and PM that I've placed on my supplier. We can't cancel the order. The process is like that. You'll have to, we'll have to get that inventory, and then you'll have to get that inventory, and you'll have to figure out a way to liquidate, right? So there is not enough capability in the system to then work or take that information and ingest it and then take corrective actions, right? And this is just one example. There are a couple of similar examples. So building that capability within the networks to be able to take that information and then act on that information becomes the third important factor. So, and all of these 3 put together, I think, defines how companies are able to react to some of these disruptions in certain ways. Clearly, technology plays a significant part, and I think over the last couple of years, it has evolved, right? For the longest time, for example, when AI/ML wouldn't have been there, when a company has 2,000 SKUs, very difficult to figure out manually, what's working, what's not working, what's happening. How do you quickly sense it? Do you only get that information 2 months after what's happened, etc.? So technology plays an important part in terms of sensing it, relaying it back in the system, and then also taking corrective actions. But at the same time, I think the processes are equally important. And a lot of companies makes this mistake where they try and implement a technology without looking at the correction in the processes, right? So let's say putting in a sensing capability, but running on a monthly S&OP cycle still does not solve that problem. So all these 3, I think, put together enables a company's capability, but enabled, especially the technology and the process piece are the key drivers.
So true. Means the examples you have pointed out, be it from a technology, everyone is talking technology, the process, and the collaboration which is required. And that's where my next question comes to Samrat, that how the collaboration happening through the S&OP cycle in the planning space, how organization, different departments are coming together. Those may be siloed, but how those are coming together, and the decision making is becoming faster. Even how the touchless decision making is happening. Why not you elaborate that?
Yeah, so I think to start with the definition of process itself, any process has got an interdependence of the steps, and there is a sequence of the steps which is there, right? So in the S&OP process, if we talk about, there are different functions which are involved. There is an interdependence between the functions. So for example, the sales system has to indicate the demand. The marketing will tell the demand, plus they will also indicate the interventions which they want to bring. The finance will talk about the profitability and the margins of the products. The procurement will talk about the availability of the raw material, packing material. The manufacturing will have to indicate the capacities which are available. And the supply chain planner will be the person who has to understand each of the information pieces. He has to, first of all, look at the piece of information in a particular sequence. So for example, the first input really has to come from the sales system. Then the marketing has to give inputs. Then comes, the finance to look at, how the overall profitability of the organization is looking like, and, which of the demands we have to fulfill first and which we can probably look at postponing slightly, and then inputs from the procurement. And so the supply chain planner has to actually look at the information in a certain sequence, and then he should be able to drive those decisions. Now the challenge which is there in front of the organizations is that to get one single platform which actually allows everyone to collaborate seamlessly. Because today, I think there are platforms which are available, but all the organizations have not got onto those platforms. So hence, people are working in silos today. But if the organization is able to bring everyone on the same platform and timestamp their information, this is the time when it is required to be input and whether they are putting it at the right time or not. And then the supply chain planner should be able to look at the information, and that makes his job easier and helps the organization to basically ensure the availability maximization, profitability maximization, and maximization of the customer satisfaction. So the challenge comes on collaboration piece itself. The organizations have understood that. I think the tech piece is the one which is probably, there are platforms of integrated business planning which are available today, which can probably solve these issues and help organizations to, the functions within the organizations to collaborate more.
Exactly. Very well said, Samrat. The perspective. While we are seeing the larger picture, the bottom down, there are inventory planners, there are supply planners, there are distribution planners, logistic planners. The roles goes on, and everyone plays a very important role in the planning space. While what Samrat said, the different functions of finance, even human resource, why the resources need to be deployed, all are playing
Let
a
me
key
not
role.
forget the HR.
Exactly. That's where our compensation gets decided, right? So very important role on that aspect.
In fact, our supply chains have become, so complex today. I mean, not complex, but the fact that, we were just talking about whether the supply chain extends up to the distributor or not. I think the supply chain today for a good Glamm extends right up to the doorstep of my customer, because I'm delivering the product to the customer today. So, and the customer also opens the door and says, "Yahan place kar do." So, that's where my supply chain actually ends.
I think very nicely put across the whole, I would say, fragmentation, which is there. Systems not talking to each other, departments working in silos, and you trying to see, okay, I do the vendor payments, but payments is done by HR. So if they don't have the right information, everyone's struggling. You don't do the payments on time, the transporter doesn't want to work with you because you give delayed payments. So there are so many secondary yet very important things which are broken in the system, because we try to fix the primary things first, because of course that's the base. But I think time today is of essence, and customer and consumer at least don't have patience. B2B, yes, it's a different problem statement there also, that costs are getting impacted if there's a force events which happen, you just mentioned Swiss Canal. Who's going to pay? Okay, delays happen. Who's going to pay the demurrage? Who's going to pay the detention? And is it the customer who's paying? Is it the company who's actually doing it paying? Or is it the logistics who's taking the responsibility? So dispute management becomes a huge issue because there's no data visibility. And everybody's trying to put it on the other person. That's your job, right? I think these are real life problems. Like everyone who talks about the supply chain is seeing it. And I'm sure there are ways to fix it. There are platforms to fix it. It's about knowing your business well, understanding and accepting the problems, and then working on it, not in silo, but I think end to end is the thing.
So true, so true. Well said, Jaya. In fact, that's where my next question comes around, that how is the inventory visibility helping organizations give the right order promising? So I will pass on to Ashwani. So share a perspective.
So, no, thank you, Rohit, and very good morning to all of you. Inventory rings a bell to all of us, and I believe inventory was never a topic, used to be never a topic of discussion, but used to be a topic of verdict that control your inventory. But I believe if you look at it 10 years ago, companies were discussing the inventory has to go down. You can't have a lot of slow moving, non-moving inventory, but the question has reversed now. So there's a study which was done by SP and economist, which said 15 years ago there was a supply chain disruption happening every 8 years, and that was the cycle. McKinsey and SAP, we did another research 2 years ago, and it said every 2.5 years now a supply chain disruption is happening. But let me tell you, in the last 3 years, I think we have seen enough incidences to conclude probably on ourselves without a study that every 6 months we are having a problem. And therefore, I was discussing with one of our very large consumer product company yesterday, and they said inventory is the biggest problem right now what they have. So, and I think there are multiple concepts which got picked up just now. And you talked about end-to-end, we talked about availability, we talked about not working in silos. So the concept which is now doing the rounds is, do we have an end-to-end inventory visibility at our end? For example, if a supply planner is getting a number from the sales department saying, let's say I manufacture juice, I want to have 20,000 pieces or boxes of juice is what I want this month. And then the role of the supply planner, let's say in the control tower, and let's say people who are doing procurement, becomes one simple thing that yes, the material has to be available. Now, understand where all the inventory is lying and ask yourself a question. There is inventory lying probably at the very first step when it is lying in the warehouse, or probably a small warehouse or a dark warehouse, which we may call it as these days. It is lying there. Then you're doing a PR and you're building up inventory there. Do you even know how much of PO has been accepted by the supplier already, and therefore that raw material is going to land up, resulting into a finished good inventory? For example, do you even know, as of today, by the time they have accepted the PO, there are 20 more POs in the making because the material is not moving. Therefore, people get jittery and they would raise more PRs. And by the time you are actually approving those POs, there's GR happening of a lot of that raw material again, and probably invoices which are pending for the same item. And finally, when it gets to the warehouse, you have more inventory lying there. At the end of the day, which I believe all the fellow panelists said, do you have the end-to-end visibility? And on top of everything, I think rightly said by Avinash also, in terms of saying, diversifying the topic a little bit. Do you know the supplier of your suppliers? So that's tier 2. Do you know the suppliers of your supplier of your supplier? That's tier 3. So there's a recent study which was done by Hackett, which said 99% or 95% organizations know their tier 1 suppliers. But there are only 11% organizations which know their tier 2 suppliers. And a staggering 1% only know which is the tier 3 supplier. And therefore, I might plan for something, and I might ask for material from my supplier, but his supplier doesn't have the inventory. And as a matter of fact, I don't even know that particular person. Or for that matter, if I may ask you a question, do you know how much of your spend is green today? How much of your spend is coming through green channel? Or can you give me a number wherein we are talking about the women empowerment? So how much of your spend is coming through women empowered organizations? Or are you helping MSME, because that's a topic on the sustainability side as well? So how much of your spend is coming from the MSME? So I think diversifying the topic a little more. When you talk about the sustainability, the end-to-end visibility becomes even more important, which would not make sure that you don't have stockouts. And I think you talked about availability, which is becoming a big topic again. And a recent research again by SAP and economists, they said CEO's first priority is right now availability of material. Mind you, CFO is saying the same thing, and cost saving is number 2, is not number 1. And therefore, if you don't have the material, you can't build the product, therefore you can't sell the product. And hence the inventory visibility becomes very important. And I think one very important point which was picked up, and coming from SAP, we hold this moral obligation of giving you an end-to-end cycle. And that's where I think Samrat talked about IBP. We can talk about procurement, which Avinash talked about. Do you even know your suppliers? And finally, the business network, where you're collaborating with your suppliers to get the material in time and get that visibility on hand. If I ask you a question today, for your top 10 critical material, do you have a live dashboard which tells you the volume of the vendor managed inventory right now on your mobile phone? If you don't have it right now sitting here, there can be another supply chain disruption because we are hearing there is another virus coming from China, or Panama Canal is now having El Nino effect, and therefore shipments are going to get cancelled. And if you're going to land up there, we know what's going to come our way again. It's another disruption. So, like I think Jaya mentioned it, it is no more requirement to say have a live business network with your suppliers, or let's say with your planners internally. Please do away with the Excel files. There are companies which are still doing it, but at least get onto a system. If not SAP, someone else, but get onto a system is going to be the need of the hour, because the disruptions are not going to stop. So if the availability has to be there, inventory has to be there, and visibility becomes important. I hope that answers.
So well said by Ashwani. So well
I'll
said.
just add visibility. We all talk about. So you might be thinking, oh, I have a WMS. I don't need it. I have a TMS. My life is sorted. I have a digital solution. But is it really working in today's way? Because I met one of the clients who's into the healthcare space, and they have these orders online now. Healthcare space is also changed the game altogether. You can actually book your services for a blood test. You can book your medicines to be online delivered. So these players already have a WMS which talks about the inventory. There is a POS which is there. So when I visited them, they say, like, you know what, by inventory, I know what is the inventory, but my POS doesn't know that if I have the visibility. Can you fix the gap between? In fact, with systems also, you will figure out the gaps, right? So it's always, to see what's the core issue of the organization. It's not always about that if you put a system, the problem is fixed. You have to see, is the problem really fixed? You have to look at those ROIs, right? So if your POS is not talking to your WMS and you don't know that what is the inventory at POS, you won't be able to deliver, and there will be issues. So I asked them, well, how do you do it today? I have put 100 people. I'm like, what? So in front of the world, you are a digital company, people can order online from you, but at the back end, how is your supply chain running? Is it still digital? And it's like I meet a lot of clients in India all the time, and I see this, and I'm amazed to see that in front of the world, it's a very tech, I would say, organization. But at the back end, when it comes to supply chain, are we really that technology forward? I think we're still doing stopgap solutions, which we have to think that how do we eliminate the stopgap and work towards a strategic solution.
Well said, Jaya. Very well said. In fact, a lot of things coming out of the discussion. One point, if China sneezes, the world gets the cold. That is happening, right? Let's see another perspective quickly, and then we will go to question and answers from the audience. So last question, which I will pose to my dear panelists, that we've seen the short-term visibility side of things. There are organizations which they have to plan in terms of next 3 year, 5 year, how much capacity needs to be set up. So, and what are the decision or intelligent decision-making process the organizations are taking so that the planning happens in a seamless fashion. So why not we hear that, Ashwani, if you want to share a perspective.
Sure. So, two very different problem statements, right? Enabling decisions in the short term versus taking long-term decisions. And I think at one point we were discussing how technology can enable certain decision-making. And I think the way technology is evolved, at least in the short term, you see that a lot of these decisions can be enabled through technology, where there could be, alert systems, work by exception, identifying, sensing information, sending it back into the value chain, saying, this is an issue, and you can take a decision a couple of weeks in advance, couple of months in advance, etc. So that's how technology can enable this along with processes. Long-term decision making, I think there's a lot of there's science, but there's also a lot of art, right? So, and taking an example, clearly, Um, somewhere I was reading. So stock markets, right? It's as much art as it is science. And people, you can enable algorithms, etc., to do short-term trading. Can't do long-term investing as much through systems. Similarly, long-term decisions have to be enabled by understanding where the market's going, what are the requirements, what are the capabilities that are needed. But one piece that's changing, in my view, in terms of who are all involved in the decision-making process from a supply chain standpoint, right? And the reason why it's changing is, and we were discussing, why supply chains becoming mainstream, etc. If you would see purely from an Indian context for a longest time, how, and taking an example of a consumer company, right? How were the consumers buying the products? They were going to a store and buying your products. So an organization had a one arm's distance from the consumer in terms of it when their products were interacting with the consumer, right? Where the purchase was being made. So even if there were processes, systems, any other pieces which were not working fine, there were inefficiencies, it was not immediately reflecting in terms of the consumer experience. Now, what has changed clearly with e-commerce is that the organizations are directly interacting with the consumer. Samrat was also saying, his supply chain ends when the product gets delivered to a consumer. So it makes a big difference now that if there is an issue, for example, if you're an e-commerce company, you don't have a great return process, and because it's your internal problem statement, but it impacts your consumer experience, his buying experience, and then it actually impacts, how a consumer sees your product or the demand, etc., gets impacted. So, which is where the decision in terms of building certain capabilities is becoming a lot more, as in the CEOs of the companies are getting involved a lot more than they would have in the past, from a future capability perspective, because a lot of these capabilities impacts how your consumer experience is then, the consumer experience gets impacted, and which is where some of these things are. So long term, I think it's not now only in silos that the supply chain takes those decisions, but a lot more, as in decisions being driven and CEOs being a part of those decision-making process.
Very well said. In fact, the larger leadership now wants to hear more on the supply chain. Supply chain, what I see and sense, is a boardroom discussion now. In every boardroom, that's the discussion which is happening. So that was more of a perspective which we brought. You saw that we moved from supply chain to the stock market. Stock markets are at a high, and why not we have the supply chains at the best of the supply chains in our country and globally. That's the expectation. So in fact, the SNOP cycle which we touched upon, that was one of the pointers to your question. But I believe that was an insightful discussion for all of you, and we look forward connecting more as a supply chain community. There are billions of dollars being pumped in. If we see US, the gigafactory is being set up. Indian government is doing a lot in terms of manufacturing side of things. And that's where this community will grow and expand. And we look forward connecting in the coming years and coming times also with you. Thank you so much.
Wow, what an interesting panel discussion was that. Can we have a round of applause for all our panelists as well as the chairperson? I would request you to kindly stay back for one photo op here.